In the last section, we threw a ton of code on the screen without really saying what the heck was going on. So this is our chance. This is where we're going to rewind just a little bit and talk about all the code that we just threw up here. So first, we'll start off with line number 1. On the right-hand side of the equals sign, we put require Mongoose. In case you're not familiar with Node, hey, no problem if you're not. This is how we do code sharing between different files in a Node environment. We installed Mongoose as a package to our project. By default, every single file in our Node project is executed in its own little scope, or it's executed in isolation. So just because we installed a package called Mongoose doesn't mean that we can just start saying, oh, hey, Mongoose, Mongoose, Mongoose all over the place and just start making use of it. Before we can make use of any package we install, we have to require it into this particular file. So by requiring in the Mongoose library, we assign it to the variable Mongoose right here. To the left-hand side of Mongoose, we're using the const keyword, which is a little bit of ES6 code. Throughout this entire course, we're going to follow ES6 as closely as possible. I will throw in some descriptions or clarifications, reminders about how ES6 as we go through it. The const keyword in particular is identical to var. Well, I shouldn't say identical, but it's very similar to var. We use it to declare variables. So it would be equivalent to saying var mongoose, const mongoose is the same thing. Const in particular means that we don't expect to be making any changes to this variable, which is definitely true because it is a library and I'm sure as heck not going to be changing a library. Okay, line 1, down. Next up is line number 3. So this is where things start to get a little bit of interesting with Mongoose, and it ties back into the diagram that we were just looking at. When Mocha first starts up, our goal is to tell Mongoose to connect to Mongo, our actual Mongo database that is running on our local machine. We initiate this connection by using Mongoose's connect function, so mongoose.connect. Then the argument to this thing is what's really important. This is the important part right here. Mongoose does not assume that you want to connect to a database that is running on your local machine. In fact, it doesn't even try to see if there is an instance of Mongo running on your local machine. Instead, Mongo requires you to tell it explicitly, very directly, what copy or what server of Mongo you are trying to connect to is. So this localhost variable, or this localhost part of the string right here, means on my present machine, try to find a Mongo database. If we were using some remote Mongo data store, or excuse me, a remote Mongo database that is hosted on some remote server, we could type in directly the port in here. So like maybe 6565, something like that. And then we would specify the port that the server or the Mongo instance was running on. So like maybe port 4000. In this case, our Mongo server is running locally, however. So all we do is say connect to the Mongo instance running on my local machine. There you go. And Mongoose kind of takes it away from there. Everything after that slash, this user's test, is another important little piece of the puzzle right here. Remember that when we were talking about Mongo earlier with some of these diagrams, I had said, oh yeah, you've got your Mongo instance, but in that instance, there's like multiple databases in there, right? Like we discussed that a little bit. That's what this last part of the string is right here. If we have multiple databases in our MongoDB instance, Mongoose is going to ensure that it connects to a database called users_test. So if I went back to this diagram and I modified this thing to kind of match up with our situation right now, we would have something that looks like this. So at this point, when we connect to Mongo, we're telling it, hey, connect to this thing called the users test, and any collections of data that we create, store them inside of that database. Note that we do not have to create a database ahead of time to be able to access it. As soon as we try to connect to this database and then save a record to it, Mongoose and Mongo are going to work together to ensure that that database is created automatically for you. So again, you don't have to create this stuff ahead of time. You can just kind of say, oh yeah, I assume this thing is here. Just go for it. Just make it happen. And Mongo will take care of everything else for us, which is really nice. Whew, line 3, almost there. Just a little bit left. So line number 4 now. Going back to our diagram of showing the kind of series of events when we start up our testing stuff, I'd said that we tell Mongoose to connect to Mongo, and then we wait for some who knows period of time, right? We don't know how long it's going to take for Mongo to connect to Mongoose. This might be a Mongo database that is like off in Europe. That is a relevant comparison for me because I'm located in the United States. What I'm trying to say by that is this could be a Mongo database that is sitting on the other side of the planet. And so we don't know how long it's going to take Mongoose to connect to it. In order to get a message back to us only when the connection has succeeded or failed, we use this once and on event handlers right here. These are both event handlers. Once means watch for Mongoose to emit an event called open one time, and once it does, run this function right here. It also says watch for Mongoose to emit an event called err, and if it ever does, run this function right here. So in practice, these two event handlers right here are our method of figuring out, hey, is Mongoose done with doing whatever it's done or trying to do? If it is, great, run this function or run this function. So in every single case, when we try to initiate this connection, I will expect either this function right here to run, saying good to go, or this function right here to run, saying, hey, something just went not quite so nice. One thing that I just want to mention, just be really clear, open and err right here, these are both very particular events that we're passing to Mongoose. I'm not making these words up. They are events that are a part of the Mongoose library. So at some point, we'll go check out the Mongoose documentation. If you go in the documentation, you'll see these events listed in there as stuff that you can listen to. The last thing I want to mention is a little bit of this fat arrow syntax right here. And just because I've had some misunderstandings in the past, when I say fat arrow, I'm like the words fat arrow. And that's modeled after like this symbol right here. This is supposed to look like a fat arrow pointing sideways, which is distinguished from a skinny arrow, which is with a dash greater than symbol. So this would be a skinny arrow. This is a fat arrow. So you'll hear me refer to these as fat arrow functions, which are another part of ES6. In practice, they behave nearly identically to normal functions with a function keyword. With Mongoose, there are a couple locations where you do not want to use fat arrow functions, okay? I will be very sure to point those out to you, okay? So there are a couple locations where we will not want to use fat arrows. I will be darn sure to make sure you know where they are. All right. I swear not all explanations of code will be as long as this took, but as we start up with this course, I'm gonna make sure that I throw just a ton of detail at you, hit all the fundamentals as early as possible. And then as time goes on, we're going to kind of wean off of the in-depth discussions, and it's going to be a lot more about writing a lot of fast code and just making stuff happen. So we'll pick up the pace over time. The last thing I want to do is I want to try running this file at the command line just, to see what happens. Well, let's just see what happens. So at the command line, here I am right here, I'm going to execute this file by running node test/test_helper.js. Let's run it, see what happens. Okay, well, I got a message that says good to go. So presumably our Mongoose library is successfully connecting to our MongoDB instance. If you did not get a success message right here, if you got an error of any kind, one thing that I want to remind you is that you need to make sure that your MongoDB database is running. So if you did not run that brew services start stuff, assuming that you're on assuming that you're on OS X, make sure that you run MongoD to get your service running. Mine, in this case, is already running, so I get an error message here. If you still get an error message after that, hey, feel free to drop me a private message or post on the forums, and we'll figure out what's going on here. Just out of curiosity, let's try changing out this local host right here and just see what happens with that error message. So I'm going to change it to just host, which I'm going to assume is going to throw an error message right here. So I'll stop my server by pressing Control-C. That kills the process. And I'm going to start up the test file again. And okay, well, that's definitely looks like an error message to me. So I think that it's pretty safe to say that at least this first little bit of code that we've placed is working correctly. I am going to change back the connection string up here to localhost, like so. And I'm just going to verify that everything still works. Okay, cool, we're good to go. All right, that's it. Discussion for the first part of our code. Again, it will not always be this long and this in depth, but for the first part, I want to make sure everything's crystal clear. Let's continue in the next section and continue working on our test environment.